So what I want to do in this particular work is to try and tease out the implications of Naoki Sakai's theory of translation at an ontological level, to consider it as an incipient ontology, and then to relate that to other similar work, particularly the work of Gilbert Simondon, a French philosopher of technics in the middle part of the 20th century. So that I want to show, essentially, that Naoki Sakai's theory of translation is a theory of what Simondon would call individuation, which concerns an ontological level. One of the enduring contributions of Naoki Sakai's innovative approach to translation has been to show how the representation of translation as a transfer across the frontier between ostensibly commensurate linguistico-cultural spheres has been crucial to the establishment of modern national subjectivity. Sakai's deconstruction of the theoretical basis of nationalized schemes of translation contains an implicit critique of cultural individuation. Under the modern regime of translation, the essential hybridity and indeterminacy of language and people that's revealed by the occasion of translation is reduced to a structural correspondence that permits the identification of discrete linguistico-cultural unities between which the transfer occurs. This is what might literally be called a metaphorical understanding of translation, a metaphorical understanding. In Sakai's theory of translation, instead of a transferential correspondence between two structures, we find operations and events that modify structure, yet cannot themselves be reduced to structure. This is exactly the sort of relationship that Simondon characterizes as analogical. A comparison between the two thinkers, or rather an analogical translation between the two, gives us cause to revisit the cybernetic logistical model that today has become the dominant paradigm for the humanities. And it may provide a chance to rethink some of the unexamined cybernetic assumptions about language and work that occasionally creep into work on intermediality or relationship in general. The goal is to deepen our understanding of what it means to uphold the idea that the relation is in principle primary. That's a quote from Mechelon, who is a leading figure in the theory of intermediality. To begin, in other words, from relation, not the terms that constitute relation. In terms of the common metaphor of translation as a bridge, this means turning the common wisdom on its head, to the point where we can see how the bridge actually is constituting the banks it supposedly traverses. So I want to speak about analogy. Analogy is commonly understood to be an essential tool of categorization for a simian brain that's ill-equipped to deal with too much information. So our brain has to filter through information and can only deal with a certain amount. So you're probably listening to my voice and you're not thinking about how your buttocks feels as you're sitting on your seat. Hence, it's played, along with theories of emergence and self-organization, a central role in cybernetics and artificial intelligence ever since Norbert Wiener and then Warren McCulloch introduced the idea of an analogous relation between the human brain and computing. Eugene Nida, who's known as one of the founders of modern translation studies, inaugurates the new discipline, which he calls translation science, with explicit reference to Claude Shannon's cybernetic reduction of communication to message transfer. Given the filiation between cybernetics and translation studies, and also we might take into account as well the fact that these theories are all being developed simultaneously, pretty much in the same epoch as the establishment of institutional area studies in the United States. A critical theory of translation ought to attempt minimally to articulate a critique of structuralism to a critique of cybernetics. So I want to do that work by putting Naoki Sakai's biopolitical theory of translation in conversation with Gilbert Simondon's critique of the ontological assumptions behind cybernetics. I turn to a pair of researchers in cognitive science, Soa and Majumdar, who propose a series of 3 propositions that have been debated by cognitive sciences in the relatively short history of this new field concerning the status of analogical reasoning. Although they adopt a conventional dialectic format, they phrase the tripartite structure in terms of a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There's really nothing dialectic about the way they think that. It's quite interesting. The first stage, which is qualified by them as a thesis, considers analogy to be a form of mapping between different structures. Both a cat and a car have a structure, the face of the cat and the face of the car. An analogy can map from the cat's eyes to the car's headlights, right? And perhaps from the cat's mouth to the car's grill. The antithesis that follows comes from negating the possibility of that structure that can be separated from mapping, and one might have added perception from analogy. Among cognitive scientists, this point of view has acquired a wide acceptance as part of what's called HLP, high-level perception, theories that reject earlier AI notions of cognitive representation. The production of analogical associations is not just a module tacked on to perception according to this idea, but it's an integral part of perception's order at a higher level. It's not important, I think, to seize the details of it, but to see the way in which thinking about the human brain in the field of cognitive sciences is exploring the limits of analogy, and sees analogy as fundamental to the way we use our brains. The production of analogical associations, curiously, So and Majumdar do not consider the discontinuity between mapping and structure, and they choose to adhere to the conventional idea of analogy as an identification of similarities between structures, as we saw with the cat and the car. They remain safely within the Kantian privileging of epistemology. It's one of the reasons why I share with Joyce Liu the misgivings about the work of the decolonial school. It is only on the basis of this limitation that we can grasp the ontology of appearance and essence, according to these people. This notion of analogical thought basically amounts to a theory of associationism, which attempts to explain perception of individual entities rather than undifferentiated continual flux on the basis of experiential analogies. So the more we live, the more time we spend on this planet, the more we build up a store or database that provides us with the basis for analogical reasoning as we encounter all kinds of new phenomena and stimuli that we're not familiar with. In the final analysis, associationism is also an implicit causal theory of cognition. And recently, in a different essay where I'm looking at the transcultural meaning of enlightenment through a comparison between Nagarjuna and Kant and Foucault, actually the key issue becomes causality and causal theory. It's one of the areas that I think Thomas Lamar's work has done made quite a contribution in identifying as the core. Often we talk about coloniality and so-called Western reason, but the core of this is really the theory of causality and the hierarchy of cause and effect that Thomas Lamar, explains very well in relation to the medical doctor and famous Japanese modern author Mori Ogai, Mori Rintaro. Perhaps this view of analogical reasoning merely passes the buck down the line, like the hot potato of mechanistic causality described by Tim Morton. So I think realizing that, So and Majumdar discern a third view in cognitive science, which they qualify as a synthesis. And this new step is realized by, according to them, integrating the structure building process of perception with the structure mapping processes of analogy. So and Majumdar's synthesis relies on the classical assumption that analogy occurs between different structures. But what happens when we look at analogy, as Simondon does, as a relation between operations rather than structures, a relation between operations? Analogy in that case would no longer be limited to structure mapping processes, but would also occur within structure building processes. It would be internal to structure. From this perspective, the integration or synthesis of which So and Majumdar speak would be what Simondon calls transductive, and not dialectical, transductive. Simondon understands analogy as an act that puts into relation two operations, while an operation is the conversion of one structure into another. It is this latter conversion that is generally taken to constitute the classic four-term A, B is similar to C, D definition of analogy. This is what So and Majumdar called the structure mapping process of analogy. Yet for Simondon, this type of conversion, which occurs between structures, is only a resemblance. He uses the technical term resemblance to describe what we normally mean by analogy. and it's not an analogy. A full-fledged concept of analogy for Simondon doesn't focus exclusively on the identity of elements within a structure, but rather includes the function that relates them. Structures must be known by the operations that energize them and not the inverse. A structure itself is always part of a processual mutation that he calls, borrowing vocabulary from physics and chemistry, phasing. Phase shift doesn't just happen according to properties or characteristics internal to an entity, but is rather the result of a relation between the potentiality of an individual, that is the potentiality of it to individuate, and the metastability of the milieu. Metastability means that it's not stable. It's prone to change, in which individuation occurs. And the milieu is not only external to form or structure, but it's also internal to it. Hence, analogy signals not just a relation between structures, but also a relation between operations. The reason why Simondon looks at operations in addition to structures is because of a critical understanding of the limits of the structural model for science. The challenge is that while structure easily lends itself to being an object of positive knowledge, operation can only be known by the discontinuities it negotiates. Simondon thus develops an explanation of analogical acts that are based on themes of non-deterministic causality and non-substantial identity. What this allows Simondon to do is to establish a parallel relation between thought and being, such that each operates according to the same paradigm of individuation through transductive relation. So already now we've kind of undone or gone beyond the opposition between praxis and theory, thought and world, experience and knowledge. Here I quote again, analogical knowledge is thus establishes a relation between the operations of individuals existing outside thought and the operations of thought itself. So it's putting thought and the world on the same plane, if I was to use a Deleuzian formulation. This kind of knowledge enables a means to conceptualize the passage from one domain of being to another by the transfer of operations. The transfer of operations from one structure to another. The strict parallelism established here also means that no entity is privileged over any other as a vantage point from which to understand existence. It destroys the hierarchy between praxis and theory. Thomas Lamar, who has written extensively about Gilbert Simondon, is also one of his translators in English, explains, and so in styling both organisms and mechanisms as objects, Simondon reminds us that these beings or modes of existence are ontologically different in degree, that is, they're analogous, but they're not ontologically different in nature or kind. They're not substantially different. On the basis of these two parallel aspects between epistemological individuation and ontological individuation, and between organisms and mechanisms, we can say that the analogical act enjoys a status that is not just epistemological, but also ontological. So it's not an act that could be attributed to anything other than the entities themselves, each and every instance in their singularity. Now I want to talk about translation. I've established kind of a quick parallel between Naoki Sakai and Gilbert Simondon, and I want to expand on that. In order to construct a story about the accumulation and transmission of cultural tradition as a story of subjective continuity that effaces the repeated indeterminacy of translational practice, it would be necessary to uphold, as Roman Jakobson, for instance, does, that translation is an operation external to quotidian linguistic practice, thus classifying it as exceptional or secondary and derivative. Naoki Sakai's theory of translation begins instead with the assumption that translation names something essential about the indeterminacy inherent in all forms of linguistic practice. What I'd like to do here is to transpose Sakai's theory of translation into Simondonian terms, to effect, as it were, an analogical translation. The connections that I'm drawing here requires to distinguish between a metaphorical understanding of translation and an analogical one. So I'm proposing an analogical theory of translation rather than a metaphorical theory of translation. Tim Morton writes, here I quote, "Metaphor is just Greek for translation, since meta means across and for means carrying." In Sakai's theory of translation, this is the epistemological representationalist view of translation. against which he advances a temporal practical view. The distinction between the two enables Sakai to show how translation, or really the representation, rather than the actual practice of translation, is mobilized by the accumulational modern nation state organized as a subset of generic humanity according to the logic of species difference or specific difference. Similarly, an analogical understanding of translation à la Simondon would look at it not as a transferential correspondence between two structures, but as a relation between two operations, each of which is related to the transformation of structure. Morton asserts that translation is an implicit theory of causality. He says causality is much better thought as translation. This is one of the very interesting parts of his controversial book. This is not a linear process, but reticulative and transductive. Here Morton says, when an iron bar clangs to the floor of a warehouse, it retroactively posits the warehouse flow in a certain way. That's what translation is. End quote. The notion of retroactivity is essential to Sakai's critique of the epistemological representation of translation. So I'd like to share a quote from the work Translation and Subjectivity. Only retrospectively and after translation, therefore, can we recognize the initial incommensurability as a gap, crevice, or border between fully constituted entities, spheres, or domains. But when represented as a gap, crevice, or border, it is no longer incommensurate. Incommensurability is more like a feeling that's prior to the explanation of how incommensurability is given rise to and cannot be determined as a represented difference, or species difference, in the arborescent schemata of the species and the genus between two subjects or entities. In other work, I've been expanding on this in terms of the problem of affect and relating it to object-oriented ontology, and then Nagarjuna's theory of interdependent origination, his critique of it. The epistemological representation of translation as an encounter between two systematically defined entities that pre-exist the translational situation transforms incommensurability and discontinuity into a representational form of the commensurable and the continuous, and we've all been struggling and encountering this problem for the past several days. In this sense, the epistemological representation of translation posits an implicit theory of causality that is basically mechanistic causality. It's not the incommensurability between or within languages that calls forth the need for translation, but rather the structural equivalence between two discrete unities. Discrete entities linked by contiguous causality constitute the implicit paradox of the epistemological representation of translation. Against this form of causality, Sakai uses the term feeling, which he gets in a critique of the transition in the Japanese understanding of language and culture in the 18th century, leading to a process that Naoki Sakai describes as stillbirth of the Japanese language. It will be noticed, of course, that what we've been calling the epistemological representation of translation essentially adopts the analogical form that Simondon calls resemblance, as opposed to analogy. Resemblance, as we saw above, exclusively concerns the metaphorical and metonymical relation between structures. In the case of translation, this would be the structuralist view of language as a system that's constituted prior to its deployment that excludes speech, parole, from consideration. Against this truncated understanding of resemblance, which Simondon associates with early cybernetic theories of information exchange, the analogical perspective promoted by Simondon takes into account not just structures, but also operations. Operations means relational processes. The importance of the attention that Simondon devotes to operation or relational process in conjunction with the structure is reflected in the way in which Muriel Combs, whose book on Simondon has been translated into English by Thomas Lamar and really signaled a seminal turning point in Simondon studies. And so I'd like to look at the way she begins her seminal work on Simondon. In the first chapter, which aims at what she calls the reality of relation, this section opens with this chapter opens with a section titled "The Operation." In this section, she explains how atomism and hylomorphism, I will explain those terms a bit more, constitute for Simondon the primary ontological errors of previous philosophy, which equates being with the givenness of an individual. In privileging the constituted term, traditional ontology has ignored the operation constituting the individual, that is, individuation as process. Now, I don't have the time here to fully explore Simondon's solution to the ontological and epistemological problems called forth by the introduction of operation into structure, but clearly the aim is to develop a science of discontinuous processes that preserves discontinuity without turning it into the commensable, as we saw Naoki Sakai was critiquing in relation to translation. Andrea Bardin, who just finished a PhD on Simondon, summarizes, what Simondon calls operation is, in evident consonance with a Bergsonian matrix, an actual process, inaccessible as such to objective knowledge. With regard to Sakai's theory of translation, a point of conjuncture with Simondon's notion of operation can be seen in Sakai's understanding of the position of the translator. If, as Combs claims, being can be adequately known only from its middle by seizing it at its center by way of the operation of individuation and not on the basis of the term of this operation, then it makes perfect sense to examine the role of the translator situated between the two audiences for whom translation is necessary. Yet, as Sakai observes at the beginning of his discussion of the position of the translator, as long as the position of the translator is set aside and viewed to be secondary with regard to linguistic practice in general, two different language communities will inevitably be posited as separate from one another in the representation of translation. And translation will be understood to be a transfer of a message from one clearly circumscribed language community into another distinctively enclosed language community. The way in which Sakai overcomes this problem hinges upon distinguishing a moment that is distinct from the structure of communicational transfer. The name for this moment is address. As a performative moment, address names the instantiation of a relation between addresser and addressee that occurs prior to and without any guarantee of the informational exchange that characterizes communication. So we might say that in what translation shows us about linguistic practice in general is that language, first and foremost, is not a linguistic event. It is first affective and ethico-political. To summarize, address thus names an operation in the Simondonian sense, inaccessible as such to objective knowledge. That doesn't mean that we can't know about it. It rather means that it should be judged by its performative effects. What does it mean, a performative effect? I'm trying to channel that directly into how entities are individuated. Cultural entities are individuated, how we recognize them as being entities. Now I want to talk about the prevalence of logistical models in the contemporary structure of the humanities as part of a critique of the neoliberal university. Bardin, who you remember wrote her PhD about Simondon, relates the asymmetry of structure and operation to a history of disciplinary formation. Serving as the main object of scientific inquiry since the 17th century, a replacement of structure by operation only becomes possible, according to Bardin, within the arrangement of the modern institutions of knowledge. Bardin's observations serve as a pertinent reminder of the practical need for a critical history of translation in the formation of disciplinary divisions of the human sciences, as they were born out of and bequeathed to us today by the colonial imperial modernity. So we won't understand how the disciplines are arranged properly unless we understand them as forms of translation, institutional forms of address and communication. This history requires a critical analysis of the way in which disciplinary divisions have been mapped onto anthropological types, as well as the apparatus of area established on the basis of such multi-layered mapping and the role of translation within that apparatus as a subjective technology of anthropological figuration. On the subjective technology of translation, I would highly recommend the collection edited by Richard Kalichman and John Kim on the work of Naoki Sakai. Closer investigation reveals that the hermeneutic circle of anthropological types that rotates through the apparatus of area is hylomorphic. It's a hermeneutic circle that's tautological because the only way that linguistics really has to define its object, because linguisticians can't agree on what the definition of a language is, but they have to have some working definition of it. They use the concept, right, in the same way that biologists, as I mentioned the other day, use the concept of species without being able to agree on a definition of what a species is. They often do that by saying the French language is spoken by French people, and French people are the ones who speak French language. Simondon's critical understanding of the analogical relation, which rescues thought from its obsession with the topographical structure of objects, is complemented by his critique of species difference, which he conducts under the rubric of a sustained critique of hylomorphism. Hylomorphism refers to the assumption that the entities of the world can be perceived in series as the imposition of structural form upon a pre-existent and passively unified matter. So it's a theory of the given, and it's also a theory then of causality, and it's also a theory of taxonomy. Hylomorphism is thus both an ontology and a taxonomy. The ascending schema of individual species genre defines the application of species logic to the social world of anthropological relations. The normalized form of this schema in the colonial imperial modernity hinges on the pivotal role played by the nation-state between the individual and humanity. The nation-state mediates between the two. Yet it's not a scheme that applies only to the internal relations among different populations within the larger set of global humanity, but it's also something that applies equally to the relations that obtain between so-called humanity and its two main others, animals and machines, during what I call the first epoch of global colonization. Today we're in a second epoch of colonization. Unlike the first epoch of colonization, takes as its object peoples, territories, and the products of the interaction between peoples and territories. Whereas the second form of colonization today takes as its object the entire biosphere, and operates the equivalence at the level of code between life and information. Just as Giorgio Agamben astutely observed in his reading of Linnaeus, the colonial imperial modernity defines man precisely as the being that is constantly trying to decide the boundaries of his species, both internally and externally. So that's Giorgio Agamben calls this the anthropological machine. That the only definition that you can come up with of what the human species is that the human species is always trying to decide what the human species is. Following Sakai's deconstruction of the normative national assumptions behind the modern regime of translation, we can clearly see how the regime of translation functions within the anthropological machine. Its task is to order human populations internally through the logic of species difference. This is particularly the use of the disciplinary divisions in the humanities. The value of Barden's historical observations about the development of the disciplinary divisions of modern knowledge is, properly speaking, not historical but genealogical. It hinges upon our engagement with the present and the projection into the future. That's why it's genealogical. While inroads against an exclusively structuralist view were made in the humanities at the end of the 20th century, this is what is called post-structuralism, the WTO's redefinition of higher education as a service industry has exercised an overwhelmingly mitigating effect on attempts to reorganize the disciplinary divisions of the humanities inherited from the colonial imperial modernity in a way that would account for social phenomena from the point of view of relations rather than structures. So from the perspective of the humanities, contemporary restructuring, right, which is the neoliberal term, restructuring, has come to mean much more than just a series of adjustments in the institutional interface between capital and labor within the university. In the circular dynamic unleashed between evaluation and valorization, humanistic knowledge production overwhelmingly returns to what Simondon calls structure, through disciplinary divisions that favor pre-constituted objects. For the humanities, then, restructuring thus means the reimposition of structure rather than relations as the primary point of engagement with knowledge. To Barden's history of structurally oriented disciplines within which we are all caught, let us add now another historical perspective that draws from Franco Berardi, Bifo's history of the refusal of work. He's writing out of the presuppositions and theoretical commitments of the Italian autonomous school. Berardi narrates this history in relation to struggles for communication. His starting point is the moment when communication among workers who had already been herded into the factory through dispossession, this is what Marx describes as originary accumulation or primitive accumulation, is interdicted by the disciplinary model applied throughout society to every single analogous space of enclosure, the factory, the school, the hospital, the family, the prison, etc. But since it is a history of work in relation to communication, our starting point should really be placed at the moment prior to disciplinary interdiction, when the first need of the capital-state nexus was to create the communicational conditions that would enable dispossessed peasants from different regions to cooperate together in a single factory, that people had to be able to talk to each other to work in a factory. But then the next problem that capital faces after getting all these people from their different regions off the land that had sustained them for a long time and into the factories is then how to figure out to keep them from talking to each other. The need to create a unified market is paralleled by the need for a unified language. The creation of standardized language under the auspices of the nation state, which always comes from the outside and above and is never an organic process from below, precedes, in a logical sense, the disciplinary interdiction that I was describing via Bifo. Bifo's history moves into the 20th century explaining communism's promise and its failure with regard specifically to communication and its relation to work. The promise was that of concrete communication around the locus of erotic, effective inner wealth, while the failure was the reality of the totalitarian state, which applied with a vengeance the model of disciplinary interdiction. Finally, during the social movements and struggles of the 1960s and early 1970s, workers globally rejecting the model of the vanguard party finally figure out new and innovative ways to establish communicative relations beyond capture by capital. And this, in the Italian context, is what's known as the refusal of work. Hence, Bifo sees the adoption of information technologies into production that begins at the end of the 1970s, not as a sign of the inevitability of technological progress and the superiority of capital to introduce innovation, but rather as an attempt by capital to respond to the workers' autonomy and exodus that gains momentum in the 1960s and 70s. The question is why were information technologies introduced into the workplace? And there have been many, many studies, sociological studies, that show that the early introduction in the 70s of information technologies into the workplace did absolutely nothing to increase productivity. So there has to be some other reason why these technologies, which when they were first introduced were not very well developed, and it's really only a period of 20, 30 years that consumers pay for the R&D for the information technology to be brought up to a level where it's really capable of being used, why this was introduced on such a wide-scale manner. And then Bifo has an interpretation which is quite unique by seeing it as a response to the exodus of labor by capital. So it's a way to capture information technology is this kind of desperate response by capital to capture labor. At a moment that's described as the technological turn in translation studies, you can refer to Snell and Hornby's work in 2006 or O'Hagan's work in 2013, when questions of media, channel, and infrastructure are fast beginning to lead the field of translation studies. A counter-history that combines the story of social speciation with that of disciplinary speciation could not be more urgent for rethinking translation's role in social relations and knowledge production. The contemporary moment that we're in ought properly to be seen as one facet of today's massive historical transition, seemingly led by the integration of information technology, biotechnology, and nanotechnology within a framework of financialization and securitization. Translation is precisely one of those places where the polyvalent semantic field of the English word species, which covers economy, biology, and taxonomy, or disciplinary division, as a general principle of modern knowledge is articulated. So it's covering the relation between economy, biology, and taxonomy. That's all contained within the English word species. And I'm going to argue that translation is a privileged field of intervention into the articulation of species. We're reminded of Michel Serres in his book, The Parasite, of his prescient observation at the dawn of the age of information technologies that, quote, "To communicate here is to calculate, that is to say, to encode. This universal can also be called money." Well, Serres' account calls attention to the link, which I would call a prototypical logistical model, between the economic and the linguistic. The gains by this opening, or the gains from this opening, are nevertheless limited. The logic of species difference through which the economy of the universal is instituted is recuperated in Serres' narration of the translational situation as a primordial gathering of nations, the word he uses, through which a multitude is formed. This creates a kind of Mediterranean myth, mobilized by the romantic identification of people and language, that cripples Serres' concept of the multitude, severing the link to indeterminacy and hybridity, or better yet, a better term than indeterminacy and hybridity is potentiality, which is Simondon's favored word, ordering it instead through the logic of species difference, presently nationalized. At the dramatic moment when, in Serres' account, he says the translator comes forward, it is simply according to a calculus of positions among language nations networked within the logic of species difference. True, Serres does proceed to argue that the position primordially occupied by the translator is not a position per se, but rather a relation to relations. But the credibility of the argument is continually defeated by the text's constant reference to identities formed in the crucible of species difference. So you find throughout his work expressions such as my tongue, the tradition of our own history, the we that he says are like the Chinese, but not individuating with Chinese. Formulations such as this intersperse a text ponderously laden with classical references, the weight of the Mediterranean myth that motivates the understanding of translation as civilizational transfer. Modernity is thus the story of Chinese becoming like us, or of becoming more like themselves, or of hopeless bastard mixes based on the ontological priority of given individuals. This parallel configuration is not a simple Eurocentrism, unless we understand by that term the institution of a much broader phenomenon that characterizes the imperial colonial modernity as a whole. This phenomenon can be described as the successive establishment of the apparatus of area as a key part of capitalist accumulation. And this is why I think the work that's being done on primitive accumulation today, which looks at the discontinuities and gaps in the capitalist accumulation regimes, is so important, because it helps us understand how capitalism continually produces things like underdevelopment. Although my characterization of Serres is somewhat unfair, it's designed to call attention to the way in which the task of thinking and breaking the articulatory links within the polyvalent field of species difference remains unfinished for theoretical intervention today. For that reason, and as implausible as it may sound, the rather marginal and weak field of translation studies might thus be fruitfully viewed as the site of a crucial confrontation. A confrontation not only with the logistical model of bioinformatic capitalism, but also with the way in which that new form of contemporary global domination interdicts communicative possibilities of resistance and liberation by mobilizing ideological elements such as national sovereignty and civilizational difference from the apparatus of area that were typical of the previous colonial imperial modernity. What I've observed in this workshop over the past few days is our attempts to negotiate this kind of apparatus and to develop a way of talking with each other across the colonial imperial divide that structures communication. And it's very, very difficult. There's a theoretical impasse in the constitution of translation studies through Jacobsonian linguistics and Shannonian cybernetics that is shared by the contemporary theories of transmediality that I'm trying to intervene in order to get this work published. It may help to illustrate and hopefully open up this crucial battlefield by highlighting the role of labor in the modern history of communication. In talking about an operation that is a dress that's inaccessible to knowledge, it seems that we have run the risk of an abstraction that could potentially push the translational practice even further into that realm of metaphor from which we set out hoping to save it. One redress to this situation lies in taking seriously the for, or act of carrying, in metaphor, taking it more seriously and more concretely than a metaphorical idea would allow. Once we recognize, as Derrida might urge, the notion that code and message cannot be rigorously distinguished, the whole idea of signs as the bearers or carriers of originary meaning becomes untenable. Having thus dismissed the problem of transfer from the outset, we need to focus on what kind of act this is. I'm calling it now an act. To the extent that this act is intrinsically productive, it's a form of labor. The concept of abstract labor, which is one of Marx's greatest theoretical discoveries, needs to be brought into contact with another great abstraction of the colonial imperial modernity, that is the logistical reduction of communication. So I want to put abstract labor, the theory of abstract labor, into conversation with the logistical reduction of communication. Of course, if you go to some of Eugene Nida's early work on translation, you will see the cybernetic model of communication, which he gets directly from Shannon, is being applied to translation. You know, the famous box A, you know, speaker A is represented schematically as a box, and there's a message that needs to be transferred from box A to box B, which is, you know, listener B. Cybernetics and linguistics have bequeathed understandings of the communicative situation that equate labor with the quantitative logic of productivity. And this deep-seated theoretical prejudice has had enormous ramifications for our understanding of translation as a social practice. In Claude Shannon's cybernetics, the transfer of messages is always configured in relation to the establishment of a channel. By its very nature as medium of transport, the channel is subject to interference, to what Shannon alternatively names enemies or noise. He's developing his theory of cybernetics in World War II, and these are all people who are part of the general US intelligence service operation during the war. So they were particularly trying to develop code that couldn't be cracked and then figure out how to code the enemy's, crack the enemy's code. In Roman Jakobson's linguistics, the body is removed from speech events, enabling its abstraction into a semiotic event. As such, it's always only concerned with positions and the transferential relationship among them. This abstraction turns on the Jacobsonian distinction between indication and signification, which is precisely the point of intervention for Giorgio Agamben's very convincing demolition of the logic of species difference at the heart of modern linguistics that he does in his early work titled Language and Death, which is really seminal for understanding most of his project until I'd say around 2010, when he goes off in a different direction. Symptomatically, visual perception is taken as the paradigmatic foundation for indication. So I can point to something, you can all see what I'm pointing to, so that means it's, you know, it exists, right? An object illuminated by a spectrum visible to two or more interlocutors is pointed to. Here I'm pointing to the camera, everybody's seeing the camera on the tripod. This is a version of visual perception that is reduced to a physical or objectivist account, one which falls apart as soon as the object at which one points or indicates is referenced by color, which disrupts the neat economies between subject and object. Color is not objective. And it's not entirely subjective either. When cybernetics reduces the labor, oh, and I should just say this is probably one of the reasons why color occupies, among all the senses, color in Buddhism occupies such a very important place. Because they've really seized the color perception, visual perception, but particularly color perception, is quite different from from the other four senses in the correspondence between object and subjective perception is much more indistinct than with the other senses. When cybernetics reduces the labor of the translator and the undisciplined fecundity of the sign to the abstraction of noise, and then calls it an enemy, an enormous step is being taken. The appropriation of social relations by the capitalist state begins with the idea that politics can be reduced to property, that property must be protected through the state's monopolization of violence, and that the activity of work must be chained to production. Work must be directed towards production. The dynamic is more extractive than productive. Information has to be extracted from communication, just as wealth has to be extracted from social cooperation. By contrast, in the translational situation elucidated by Naoki, we find that what cybernetics calls the channel can't be distinguished from the translator, any more than the communicational transfer could be imagined apart from a moment of address. In the translational situation, the noise that inhabits the channel of translational transfer is precisely the labor of the translator, as well as the work of the sign. Yet in exactly the same fashion that the notion of abstract labor reduces the process of valorization to exchange value, the linguistico-cybernetic abstraction of the role of the translator reduces her role to that of a facilitator of transmission or exchange. So how then do we understand the labor of the translator? Recent methodologies that emphasize the politics of translation bring sorely needed visibility to the translator's active role, but do little to help us understand the biopolitical aspects of translational work. Biopolitics, Bifo reminds us, represents a morphogenetic modeling of the living operated by the habitat with which it is required to interact. It's a kind of simplified Simondonian language, actually. The difficulty in approaching translation concerns the status of the habitat, what we could call it, Indian or Chinese or Japanese or French or English. A biopolitics of translation focuses on the way in which translation is part of the phase shift in the metastable milieu in which translation occurs and through which translational subjects are individuated. That milieu or habitat could never be reduced to the positivity of a code or the recognition of an identity. A significant part of the labor of translation occurs outside of the direct product of translational labor. It occurs in the mobilization of pre-individual share, that is both langue and parole together. By contrast, the focus on identity at the heart of the politics, not the biopolitics of translation, is unable to perceive the articulatory role of the nation-state in guaranteeing the cross-reference index of species difference across the different domains of economy, biology, and general taxonomy or disciplinary divisions. In other words, the politics of recognition and representation can't bring us all the way to understanding how translation functions as a subjective technology in the apparatus of area, essential to capitalist regimes of extraction and accumulation. It will not help us to understand, for example, the subjectification that's engaged by what's called today the localization industry. It's the biggest industry now. It's the biggest part of the translation industry, globally speaking, the localization industry, which often means like how you translate a website into a local language in a way that presents your product in a way that will be attractive. The reduction of culture to metonymic codes is only the beginning. Localization is premised on the cybernetic assumption of information rather than formation, the assumption that information is extractive by nature, and that translation plays no role in the active, ongoing process of cultural individuation. The digital tools upon which the industry relies enable even those who can't speak or write foreign languages fluently to perform and produce marketable translations. Thus, the translator worker engaged by the localization industry could be doubly alienated from the work of translation, and translation becomes part of a larger system of social de-skilling. Social de-skilling. Crucially, the sociality at stake concerns not only the relations among humans, but also the relations with entities assumed to be the other of the humans, such as the information systems, that form an increasingly important partner in the work of translation. Muriel Combs reminds us that Simondon's concept of labor can't be reduced to productivity. The first point of distinction concerns the excess of potentiality over production. There is a poietic dimension or a creative, a generative dimension to labor beyond its role as praxis. The pre-individual share from which every instance of individuation must draw can never be equated with the teleological end or effective causal origin of a generative process. This is mapped out in a complex way by Antoine Berman in his understanding of translation through the German Romantic categories of the image, Vorbild, Nachbild, Urbild, Das Bild, and formation, Bildung. The labor of the translator doesn't simply culminate in a product that we normally call the translation. Nor is the translation itself, as Walter Benjamin sensed in his discussion of the afterlife of a work, a terminal point. The translation works on both the so-called source and the destination alike. And it also works upon what Sakai identifies as the essential hybridity of the translator. For this reason, we might say that the labor of translation is always an example of what Gregory Bateson calls a double bind, a paradoxical form of communication that creates the terminal points between which it's supposed to form a bridge. In the Simondonian concept of labor, which we now apply to translation via Sakai, and the category of productivity concerns the difference between work as deployment, that is, the deployment of tools and machines and a logic of means and ends, and work as relating, i.e. individuation at a multiplicity of levels, or what Berardi calls eros. In Combs, Simondon, or again in the marks of today's theorists of primitive accumulation, labor is always an anthropological transformation. Alienation occurs precisely when the worker is socially de-skilled. As we saw above with the example of the localization industry, technological upgrades and the skills required to manipulate them do not preclude simultaneous de-skilling of labor's morphogenetic social activity. So that's what's happening in translation industry today, is that there's a technological upgrade going, and of course you have to spend a considerable amount of time being trained in how to use mostly the software tools that are important, but it's also producing this, what I call a social de-skilling at the same time, because now you can have professional translators who, with the aid of these applications, don't have to have a fluency, a command of the knowledge. These two differences that distinguish a Simondonian idea of labor from simple productivity coalesce in a single understanding of labor as both praxis and poiesis, production and creation. To understand translation in this way is to refuse to concede to a version of human nature that is essentially prosthetic, always requiring the supplement of a tool, and for that very reason perpetually exposed to and crippling limited to the dialectical choice between being either a master or a slave in the trade and traffic of species difference. Now we can begin to appreciate the dimensions of the arena in which political and social struggle defined by translation occurs. Generally speaking, the labor of the translator has been vitally important to the modern articulation of species in all its senses. As a result, the subjectivity of the translator must be within the regime of accumulation, that of a laborer who does not know. And I think for a long time it was really possible through invisibility and the socially sanctioned gender roles to prevent the translator from being a subject of knowledge. The translator was invisible. The translator had really nothing to say. It was not the translators who would be the real interpreters. It was, other experts and specialists, and usually this was also gender coded. There was a feminization of the translator. The operation of translation, as we saw above, cannot be identified per se. It takes the form of an event or a relation, that is the phasing of relations in language that occurs in the moment of address. Yet blinded to the operation, labor is reduced, according to Simondon, to a hylomorphic scheme that imposes form on passive and indeterminate matter. So, as the labor of translation is alienated, it begins to work within and for the apparatus of area, turning linguistical cultural potentiality into abstract labor for the economy of species difference. Technological prosthesis plays a greater and greater role. I think what we've been talking about in our seminar partly is the way in which actually literature is a template for this kind of technology. Of course, literature nowadays is vastly outdated, right? It's anachronistic. But we can find in the way in which newer technologies are being deployed some of the same operations with regard to subjective formation in the production of knowledge. The most valuable things that we can find in the old human translation, which is now being more and more replaced by a kind of cybernetic human-machine interface translation. The most valuable things that we can find in this form are its weaknesses. These weaknesses would be the propensity for failure and errancy. Seen from the vantage point of translation, what communication reveals is not a situation of informational transfer, nor the code that unconsciously speaks through language, right? But rather the discontinuity and disjointing that calls for translation in the first place. Yet influenced by cybernetics, translation studies, unfortunately, could only look at this disjunctive propensity in terms of lack that has to be overcome. This was a form of fidelity that could only be judged by adherence to rules and structures, the fidelity of the translation. Object love. Mostly, my experience in the area studies is that's mostly what it is. It's a kind of, you devote yourself, you commit yourself to an obsessional relation with the object that is taken by your field to be the legitimate object. And then you adhere to, in your love, you adhere to principles of methodology and theses concerning the legitimacy of your disciplinary object. But the true secret of translation is that of its potentiality, not its lack. Mutative and generative as well as productive, it doesn't operate like a grammar. It doesn't have to adhere to the logic of species. Translation is a laboratory of individuation. Today, machines are being invited into this special laboratory. But instead of welcoming them as a partner in transindividuation, a mode of being that is not governed by species characteristics, we de-skill ourselves and chain ourselves and chain them. We de-skill ourselves and chain them, that is machines, to economy. Under the dominance of logistics, capital now possesses a formidable capacity to communicate. It speeds exponentially faster than social labor. So actually, labor now is at quite a disadvantage with regard to capital, because the means of production of communication have been captured by capital in a long historical process that includes the formation of nationalized languages and now has really been sealed by the total investment in information technologies. If resistance in this situation is futile, that is only because the model of resistance still hinges on a logistical metaphor of circuits, flows, and structures. Of course, resistance itself is from the vocabulary of energy flow, right? For that reason, translation as an analogical experiment in morphogenetic transformation suggests a field of intervention that does not have to rely on speed to be effective. much like the biologist Stephen Jay Gould has argued in his critique of evolutionary uniformitarianism, with ideas about reticulate evolution and partial recapitulation, or as Thomas Lamar describes neoteny, a special case of heterochronon forward progress that does not happen in a linear fashion but arises through a sort of return to the sources of being.